Hello and good afternoon. I am Sam Thompson, Senior Managing Director at Progress Partners, and I am happy to welcome you all to this week's panel, Consent and Identity, Implications for the New Data Economy. This is the second panel of our second Progress Connect webinar series titled Business Growth Hacking. This week's webinar has an all-star panel of industry execs and data gurus to give you a broad slate of perspectives and projections of how the data economy will evolve over the next 3 to 5 years. With that, I will pass it over to Brasi to introduce our panelists today. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks everybody for joining. Anticipating a lively conversation today, and really some, I hate to use the word education, but I think that's right, about what we're going to see kind of in the changing data landscape and the implications to the consumer, the implications to brands, the implications to publishers and beyond. So it is an amazing group of talented entrepreneurs who have great success and understanding in the larger data sphere. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Ben Barokas.
And thanks for the invitation. So excited to participate in this panel. As Brett mentioned, my name is Ben Barokas. I'm the founder and Chief Executive Officer of SourcePoint Technology. We are an ecosystem leading consent management platform and data privacy analytics provider to some of the biggest brands within the advertising and marketing ecosystem.
My name's Tim Burke, CEO of Affinio. We have built a custom graph technology that can overlay on top of massive consumer data sets. And what it does is identifies patterns across those based on the connections inside the consumer data set. So it unlocks net new segments and the affinities associated with those data-driven personas. So used heavily for personalization, oftentimes in the marketing, both on the buy and sell side.
Great. Matt Spiegel.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. Hi, everybody. As title says, I lead up, one of the things I do is lead up our marketing solutions practice for TransUnion. TransUnion is certainly known for many things. Many people mostly know us as a credit reporting agency. We're actually expanded well beyond that, and we think ourselves as a global insights and analytics business. Within the marketing solutions area, which we'll be focused on today, we think a lot about the importance of identity and the really being an enablement solution provider for the coming world of people-based or identity-driven marketing. We leverage our various data assets and data science capabilities to build a suite of identity and audience-driven solutions.
My name is Nate Woodman. I'm a independent consultant. I have a long history of working for agencies and ad tech companies. Mostly around building measurement and optimization solutions on behalf of brands. So I'm here, representing that side of the equation.
And as Sam said, I'm Brett Brasi. I'm a managing director at Progress Partners. I spend a good deal of my time thinking about the data and the larger digital economy and the transformations that we're seeing there. So with that, I'll just set up what we're really going to talk about, which is, we're witnessing, I think we're at the beginning of a revolution in the way we've been doing business since the turn of the century, AKA 20 years ago, 21 years ago. And with that, I think the changes are really around consumer behavior, where, they respect their privacy and they're looking for a value exchange. And some of this started with, big data breaches that were more about financial data, and others now have been personal data that's been hacked. And then there's the other part of this is regulation is finally going to raise its head and get more crispy, which is going to change the publisher relationship, the consumer relationship. I think you're going to see consent as the first part that's important, right? So that with the loss of third-party cookies, you're going to need really consented approval to take data, share data, and do others. And that changes a little bit about we call first-party data, but I think we'll have a better term in a few years about what first-party data really is and how I link that to second-party data. And if it's all consented, there's companies that are solving for that. But it really, if you imagine that the currency, or certainly one of the biggest tools we've used to conduct the marketing side of the internet, is going to be largely deprecated along with MAIDs being mobile IDs and hashed emails being deprecated, and a reliance now on consented access to information from the consumer. I think this changes the whole economy, and somebody that thinks about the implication of this and the growth area, because I think a lot of people start working on point solutions that can solve parts of this problem. And in a more global way, Nate Woodman really thinks about this, and I find him to be an expert in the area. And so Nate, maybe you can kind of think about or share with the larger team what you think about, consent, personalization, identity.
What's happening, as there's a couple forces, at play that he already described. Is you have the impact of privacy, whether it be regulation or whether it be kind of industry or publisher self-imposed regulation, that is changing the underlying landscape of the data assets that we all use, right? And I think for some context, if you look at the history of specifically measurement and optimization, the industry has always used digital IDs, right? And so that could be the mobile ad IDs, that could be mostly third-party UUIDs, and that's been the basis of optimization. And people would build measurement systems around it and algorithm systems around it and kind of tell themselves that they actually thought it was true, but it never was, right? And I think the best point to bring that home is, the last time I got to look, I think there was, this was maybe about 2 years ago. There's 1.6 billion digital device IDs in the US on an average 30-day period, right? And so when you look at that, landscape, those are, again, the MAIDs, the third-party UIDs, the IDs that are being reset. It is an unstable, form of identity. And when you have unstable identity and you build optimization and measurement around it, it's wildly inaccurate and it doesn't work, right? So what we have here, what I think we have here with the movement of privacy is that we're moving away from using digital IDs towards real identity, but it'll be consented identity and be closer to PII, right? So that opens up an opportunity to do a number of things. One is to handle measurement and optimization in an omni-channel manner, right? And so that you can have your offline data and your online data that's operating in the same identity space. Two, which gives you the ability to make much more accurate measurement and optimization systems, right? Now I would expect that size of the ID pool obviously shrinks from 1.6 billion, but through consent, right, through properly managed consent across multiple publishers and multiple brands, you can end up with a very large sample, right, of a data asset that maybe ends up being in 40 to 60 million, who knows what it is, but of like PII data that you can start using to build models, measurement, optimization that should fundamentally be much more accurate than they are today, and therefore also be much more effective. So that's how I see it, is that we're moving from digital IDs and we're moving much closer to very stable identity with consent and the use of PI that can operate in the digital sphere as well as the offline sphere.
Right, you're on mute.
Everybody likes me better on that. Thanks, Matt. I don't know what anybody else, Ben, that was, Ben, Jesus. That was great, Nate. And what I'm thinking about that is we're going to need better systems to manage consent because I think I think big publishers and others are going to be nervous that they're going to get sued for not having it or backlash against that. And Ben, I think that's where you're thinking your head is at, somewhere around how we're going to manage this consent.
Absolutely. And I think we have to take a very user-centric view of who users think that they're doing business with and under what pretense. And I think it really has to be driven by transparency and value exchange. The publishers, and I'll talk about sort of publishers writ large, whether that's a website or an application on your telephone or your tablet or your television for that matter. You start understanding I'm doing business with CNN, I'm doing business with TikTok, I'm doing business with Snap as a user, and I'm exchanging my attention and my data for that rich content or rich digital utility experience. And the key part of that equation is value exchange. and users are happy when they have choice and when that value exchange is transparent. And what we all need to think about is the friction involved in explaining that value exchange. And going back to the beginning of the internet, the sort of original sin was not to have that communication, but it's become absolutely crucial for publishers writ large, and for that matter, for brands and marketers and advertisers, all to have that communication with their users. Because in the end, the user really wants all of that rich content and digital utility. And 9 times out of 10, they would much rather raise their hand and say, please have my data and some amount of my attention in exchange for the goodness that I'm getting in free email and free videos and, you know, great pictures of Kim Kardashian. Folks are all about that. And so the more that we can educate in addition to legislate, the better the whole ecosystem will be.
I think there are 2 interesting points. I think both what Nate and Ben are bringing up. I think one is, you know, jumping from where Ben, you just ended up. I do think that one of the things that we as an industry can do a much better job of reminding everybody is that there is an inherent value exchange in the fact that we share some personal information. And I think most of us actually are willing to share data in exchange for that. In exchange for that trade. And I think to your point, what we haven't done, I think, a very good job of is limit the edges of that, right? So that one consent doesn't mean I've consented for quote everything. And I think that's certainly where some legislation and regulations I think are needed and are helpful. But in general, my sense is that we as consumers, if we think about it, appreciate the personalization we get, the ease of use we get as a result of all those digital technologies. I do think what's interesting, as Nate, you kicked off the conversation as well, is I do think that there are 2 topics that are intertwined, but are 2 different topics. Like one is the accuracy of identities, and the second one is how you create consented identities. I think it's a good thing that the business is moving away from a single identity idea or a device idea to really a people-based identity focus. And I think that's where, you know, one of the reasons I joined TransUnion is because of the ability to think about those data sets, you know, writ large. You know, the ability to touch PII is critical. And I think the ad tech and MarTech ecosystem by and large has wanted to avoid touching what we think of as regulated, you know, personally identifiable information, but actually you have to. At the base of everything we're talking about doing, somebody has to hold on to actual people-based identity information and then match it up. And so I actually think that's becoming more important as privacy becomes more important, because it's going to require more data signals. It isn't going to be simply a device ID or simply an email or hashed email or simply any of these things. You're going to have a yes and strategy, because in many cases you're only going to be able to get at so much information. And so I think as the intersection's clear, but there are also 2 topics I think that are relevant here. Brett, you're still muted.
I was agreeing and talking to my screen at the same time, and I do think the value exchange is super important. And the other problem is really the way we consider consent right now is I don't know that it's clear to anybody what they're agreeing to, and you're going to have to get that squared away, I think. And then that kind of brings up this.
I think we're going to have to do it more globally, Brett. I think that the balkanization of the legislation, GDPR being one thing, CCPA being a different thing, and then a raft of other states coming online in addition to Brazil and Japan. I think the industry needs to have clear, cogent conversations with users and get out ahead of the legislation. Trying to draft and have different experiences depending on where you are, I think is doing a disservice to the ecosystem and a disservice to the users, but it's making very good business for companies like mine. So it's not all bad, but I think that clear communication around value exchange, around compensation choice, right? That users have an ability to compensate the companies that build the experiences and deliver the content can be done in a multitude of ways. I think when that becomes clear, everything begins to get better. And then all the rest of it, all the details around, oh, who are the additional vendors that we're sharing the data with, for what purposes, for how long, under what auspices, like those things start to flesh out in deeper levels. And the more control that you give users, you know, the better you feel. Again, I think we have to do well by doing good, and doing good is increasing that level of transparency, and transparency not just from a regional perspective, but really from a global perspective.
So to the larger group, do we end up with, I mean, the hiccup here is walled gardens in a way, because we can do all these things, and I understand consent, but if you're a big brand, and I'm only thinking perspective like where Nate has set and spent his career, do we end up maybe, you know, this could be for Tim, I suppose, but do we end up with a different way to engage with walled gardens? Do we get more of them? We get less of them? What happens here?
Yeah, I think the trend is obviously the world sort of waking up, and certainly on the enterprise side, to having to establish what they perceive as their own walled garden. I think beyond consent, and obviously this is, you know, relevant to today, is that, you know, the identification and the resolution down to the identification at PII level that, you know, that Matt's even speaking about, I think is completely relevant. I think it's equally relevant is that the personalization goes beyond those PII elements, right? And for true personalization, understanding the sort of affinities and the behaviors of those consumers at the PII level becomes super valuable to the organization. And ultimately, it's, you know, it's less about these organizations necessarily knowing or being exposed to that level of PII, but understanding thematically what are those behavioral changes that are going on amongst my user base that is consented, and how do we leverage that as an organization for growth, right? And I think that's what we're sort of seeing is sort of part of that transformation, that beyond sort of the data collection and obviously the management on the consent front is how are you leveraging that value internally. And to Ben's point, I think, you know, in what becomes more challenging is obviously in a frictionless model to the consumer, how do you expose that level of sort of modeling and capability that you're trying to build and have to build as an organization to achieve the personalization that we as consumers want.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, can I comment on that, Brett, too? Or Tim, you know, something, you know, that you said about the, you know, kind of in the about managing the identity and, you know, having that data, you know, as a brand and interacting with walled gardens, right? I want to pick up on that. You know, if a brand has a data, it has its own data, it's first party data, maybe transaction data, or it works with a, you know, you know, data provider like TransUnion. You can create a feedback loop on like how you create your segments and how you push them into walled gardens, and you can create an optimization system that does not require you to get any data from the walled garden, right? So it's not like you need to have, you know, it's not like you need to have the publisher ad exposure data, right, in order to run an optimization system. So you have to redesign and rebuild, right, how you do your optimization, and maybe it moves from individual IDs to cohort based. And maybe this opens up, you know, a new paths to build newer optimization systems. But what I think is super encouraging around it is that, you know, what we're trading off here, like what I said earlier with the 1.6 billion, you're trading off, you know, kind of this perception of infinite reach, right, for stability and accuracy, right? Mm-hmm. And when you get stability and accuracies in your measurement and optimization systems on behalf of a brand, you can build much better AI and ML models off of it. Right. So I would actually say that, you know, kind of one of the silver linings here, right, you know, kind of pushing into privacy and pushing into stable identity that comes through consent, is that we get much better AI and ML models out of this, which dramatically, in my view, would dramatically improve the customer experience with the brand. So that's how I see the future. But it has to be rebuilt and redesigned because it wasn't built that way to begin with.
Yeah. My thing about what Affinio does, and why I think it's interesting, is if you think about, we think about people-based marketing as the individual, but as individuals, we find out new things because of like-minded people or not like-minded people, you know, however we discover the news feeds and those other bits. You know, I'm not always thinking about how this works to sell an ad. And that kind of gets to another piece, and I don't know who wants to jump on it, but we have a question that says user managed consent starts to get muddy when companies heavily leverage second party agreements. So how do you see the issue of user managed consent when it comes to companies that are utilizing data that isn't apparent? That's the question. So first to second.
Yeah, again, I think a lot of that gets back to transparency. And so, you know, if from my perspective, if a publisher or an advertiser, and we can go outside of that, or just a brand in general, say an airline has a loyalty program that they want to bring in someone new to process that data in order to make a more personalized offering. I think that transparency is the right part of the equation, depending on where that line is for personally identifiable information. And that needs to be brought back to the user, and permission needs to be asked and granted if that's going to happen. And some of that requires logistical nightmares, right? And understood that again, the additional friction reduces the amount or reduces the ability until that's granted, and some people will never grant that. But that being said, the amount of value that you're able to derive once it is granted is so much higher. And so going back to the idea that it requires a value exchange, you're asking the user, this is going to be that much better for you because. And if in fact the user agrees with you, they will grant permission. And those terms and conditions, I think, can't be as broad as they were in the past. They're going to need to be more narrow and more clear in terms of not in legalese. I think we're going to have to talk to the average man or woman to be able to explain to them to the value exchange and make it clear that they can sort of opt out.
Yeah. Matt, I was thinking of TransUnion, and you know, my little commercial for you would be that, you know, everything from consent to offline data to online data to what you share. I mean, obviously privacy is a huge piece, and then just kind of doing all of this ethically, because, you know, it's both regulated and core to the company. You know, there's talk of clean rooms for the larger group, which would be, you know, I have a data set over here and a data set over here, and they meet somewhere in the middle in a clean room, and we maintain our data sovereignty, because as big brands, you know, having to share my hard-earned, expensive first-party data, and you know, somebody just gets to keep it essentially in a match. I guess what I'm asking is, how do you think of the ideas of what is first party and second party and third party data? Yeah.
You know, well, I think a couple things important. I got hit on that point in a second. I think the thing you teed up, I think is a lot of what we're all talking about in different ways is the fact that in a world where two things are true, we have to use more sophisticated and more disparate data sets, and they have to be linked and they have to match, where identity matching is harder, and it's going to have more information that we're all going to be responsible. Anyone that touches data in that way is going to have more responsibility for following both government regulations as well as kind of improved ethical and best practices. And certainly one of the things that companies like TransUnion have done for decades is have to live in a world of regulation, right? We live in our core business being that in the space of credit means we have a massive compliance engine. And I think what will be interesting in my mind is I think it's an asset for us that could be something we productize and help the market facilitate, but because it'll be interesting to find out how many companies want to replicate and build out a compliance engine. If you think of most of companies in our quote digital ecosystem, if you will, most are choosing not even to touch the most sensitive data. How do you then go about building compliance? So I do think there is a value add somewhere that companies like TransUnion could offer to the market. That's not what we do today, but clearly there's an asset there. And then you asked about the data labels. Listen, anyone that knows me knows I have a soapbox on an aversion to the fact we call things first, second, and third party data. Even the notion of second party data for me at some level is kind of weird. I get how we use it, but you know, if it's not mine, it is by definition someone else's. You know, listen, I think we just have to do a better job of recognizing that as two things are true in my mind. One is every company that has data on their customers should leverage that to the best of their ability, that you certainly want to start with as much raw intelligence that you are collecting from the direct consumer relationship. But I think a second thing is true, which is the idea that any one company, other than your really mass scaled social platforms, right, are going to have all the consumer data necessary to fulfill this personalized, people-based marketing, identity-driven, whatever phraseology you want to use, world, that any one company is going to have all the data required to make that possible is, to me, just next to zero. Like, it's just not going to happen. And so I think a lot about how do we create what today looks like a lot of data marketplaces, and I think will continue to evolve. But an idea that I've been thinking about is the notion of just-in-time data access, right? That no company is going to likely have everything they need. And so how do I go to a marketplace, find data that's sourced from other parties, that is, quote, third-party sourced, but actually isn't bad data, right? Third-party data isn't bad data is bad, right? If all third-party data was bad, then no one would want to use shopper marketing data from a retail store, right? Now, that just doesn't make any sense. What we've gotten used to in our industry is just bad signal. And so what we need to find is a better way to just access high quality data and do it at the time of need so that it is properly consented. The use cases are kind of managed. So I think we'll be better served by getting past the labels and talking more about how you can do a mix of things to manage better personalized marketing.
Thank you.
And Matt, just on that, if I can hop on that concept, the whole concept is sort of aggregation of, or the utility of a third-party data or bad data, as you per se. A lot of the conversations we're having with, obviously, sort of many even global sort of CPG who need to exploit that, obviously, because their pool of sort of first-party and rich attribution and attribute data is fairly weak. But one of the things that we're seeing in market too is a lack of sort of utility to identify what is a good and bad third-party data asset, right? And the need for that is starting to emerge, I would say, as much just sort of double clicking on what Nate said relative to leveraging first-party data into the walled gardens. Many of these organizations are obviously leveraging a third-party data asset to try to build some intelligence before they actually inject that into a walled garden. The utility and a deep understanding of sort of what you learn from that data asset, or a means with which to actually measure the utility of those additional data assets, is something that is a huge gap in the marketplace as well, right? To
Totally
identify
agree.
what is valuable and what isn't from an enterprise perspective. Right now, we're seeing most of that being sort of manually done and sort of done on a one-by-one basis. That broad utility of valuable data is also lacking in the marketplace right now.
In fact, I'd argue most of what people think is really good identity solutions right now are not very good identity solutions. Most people at best are matching devices. And towards that end, we've just partnered. There was a press release that came out. There was a bunch of companies in this space. We've picked one to initially partner with, a company called TruthSet, a new company, some ex-ComScore guys that are looking for creating that kind of quality score of data to that point. I mean, we believe the same thing. We know and are very confident that our data stands alone. But Tim, to your point, where's the independent arbiter that's going to be able to approve that? We're all for that. I think that would be, if our industry over the next several years does what we did to the media quality game, which was find ways to rate media quality. If we can do that for the data game, I think that'd be great news.
Yeah, I think
I would even go so far as to say it needs to be done from a consent perspective as well, understanding, what is the quality of that consent, because I think all consent is not created equal, and there's very many levels and dimensions of compliance and understanding by users and communication by endpoints with those users that are going to need to absolutely be taken into consideration, especially when brands are purchasing data or brands are purchasing inventory, that people have to be very aware of what that brand reputation might be, and what that, not only reputation, digital citizenship, but also legal risk, right? What is the legal risk of utilizing that data? What is the legal risk of buying that inventory? And so they need the ability, to your point, to score that consent alongside of scoring that data. right? Because otherwise there are very big fans, there are very, very big fines and very big reputational risks for brands that don't pay attention to the quality of consent and the quality of compliance writ large. Sorry, Nate, you were going to say something. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, I would look at it. We were talking about the quality, right, and the accuracy, right, and Matt even mentioned, kind of a lot of the leading solutions out there are, if you actually do independent tests against them, end up being highly inaccurate, right, and kind of in the need for external verification. We talked about TrueSet, as an example. But I would look at it a little bit differently. I would say that, kind of if you're a brand, it's buyer beware, right? It's like you can't trust people's word for, that they have, this many IDs and that it's accurate, et cetera. And that, brands need to do things like, have an external, source of like ground truth information that they believe in, that they can then, you can then test for accuracy, right? And against the individual providers and kind of assemble the right solution. So, kind of I want to put that in there, right? Is that, you can't trust, the device graphs, the data solutions, et cetera. But, if you're looking at it the right way, is like you need to have a ground truth set so you can externally verify, on your own, right? Kind of with the efficacy of the solutions that you're buying, right? So I think that's one approach to kind of like managing the accuracy.
Mhm.
One of the things that I heard too, Ben, you were talking about the consent, and I'm looking at the first two questions in the Q&A too, right? That most of them are, the two questions are, kind of they're back to consent, as a topic, as opposed to identity. And one of them talks about the murkiness, right, of managing second party agreements. And I think what's being referred to there is that, most companies right now are doing things like they're utilizing OneTrust, right, to make sure that all their contracts are GDPR and CCPA compliant, right? And so so that's managing a kind of a contractual and a legal element, kind of like to consent between all of the providers that you use, right? But what the industry doesn't really have, and you have companies like Ben's company, SourcePoint, that are making a play here, is that there's not really any technical enforcement of that, right? And so you have to have, in order to have a consent, you have to have, the publisher has to agree that they use these these second party providers. They have contracts with these providers, whether it be SSPs, data partners, et cetera. And the user, the consumer, also has to raise their hand and said, yes, I have consented, to allow, to allow these different providers, say, kind of like a certain SSP or a DSP or a data provider. So at any given transaction, the publisher has to say that we have consent, and the consumer has to say that they have consent, right? And so I think that there's opportunities for consent management companies to do things like manage that handshake between the publisher and the user to make sure that there's a consent handshake, and that can be managed on the edge, which provides a technical enforcement, right, of those, second party contracts and the contracts that the publisher has, between them and the user. So I think you handle the murkiness, right, which is you move from legal agreements and enforcement that way to technical enforcement and to managing the consent chain and the consent handshake with technical manners by having these systems on the edge, that kind of stop transactions, kind of as they occur, that are non-consented transactions as they occur.
I ask a question either for Nate or Mid, maybe for either of you guys or both. There's a interesting perspective, I guess, from you guys, which is, listen, there's a have to legally, right, which is GDPR and other, and so in Europe and other countries around the world, will undoubtedly be much more restrictive than we're going to see in the US, right? And we have CCPA at the moment, but it is an opt-out framework. It doesn't, the quote have to from a legislation perspective isn't actually there. And so, I guess Nate, and I think we lost Ben for a second. I know he was having some technical challenges.
Jump back right.
Yeah. Nate, and I guess, the quote, that individual handshake, right? I mean, do you foresee a world where literally us as consumers are literally going to consent for every little incremental point of data use? Like that seems like a highly unlikely world to me.
I think what happens is that the regulation, to answer that question, I think the regulation pushes the interaction of consent, right, to that level, right? Where like every single provider, you gotta need to check the box in the user agreement as here's a provider that we use, here's the purpose that we use them, right? And that has to be done, right? And I think the consumer, because of the way the law is written, has, if they're going to have to go through the painful process of seeing this huge thing in front of them that basically says, here are all the providers that we use and here we consent to use, right? I think there's eventually, I think it's going to get very cumbersome. And so what I eventually think that happens is that consumers get tired of it, right? And so they just have there's a big button, kind of when they go to the website that basically just says, please give me the internet the way it used to be without all these freaking pop-ups, right? And so I think it's a pendulum swinging. It's like you have to present the consumer choice, but the consumer, once presented with the choice, just basically says, forget it. So some of them will opt out, right? But others won't. And so that's how I think it moves, is that you have to present the consumer with that opportunity, but I would bet that most of them don't go.
Well, I mean, to your point, Nate, I mean, I think that there's some work being done at the IAB and a number of other associations, as well as the W3C, where the interaction of identity, privacy, and consent come together, where the conversation happens around does that easy button, so to speak, exist in the browser or in the user agent in the application. More and more we're seeing those pop-ups on an app-by-app basis. I think everybody will understand, like when apps are using your background location. So in an Uber or a Lyft, for example, the iOS asks you, hey, can this app continue to utilize your location and your background? And I don't think that those things are gonna end up going away, because I think that's an app by app decision. And you're doing business with Uber, and you would rather that them show up at your door versus having to type in your lat long or type in your cross streets. And so you want to be reminded about who's actually utilizing your location or who's tracking you cross site. I think it was a disservice to the user that Apple goes all the way down into multiple levels of privacy menus in order for you to reset your mobile ad ID. Nobody actually makes those connections. That said, I think it'll become much more intuitive over time as to where's the easy button on a website, where's the easy button on a browser, where's the easy button on an app that people can set their settings, and are those settings making it so restrictive that the app or the website is not able to monetize you over time? And I think that's, when you talk about a pendulum swing, I think that's where we have to get more exacting and understanding what is the level of monetization that is allowed by a publisher within an application environment, and what is the monetization that's allowed from a user perspective, from a web aspect, and how do we as an industry look at that? And that's work that we're certainly investing in, and technology that we're developing internally as well as partners.
So, two things. One is I've been in touch with regulators. I don't think there's going to be this easy button because I think it's going to get legislated out. It may happen for a while, but I think it's going to have to get more defined. The industry self-regulated since the beginning, and I don't think the industry's it shouldn't, and it won't put its own cuffs on. It's just not the nature of the business. So I think you're going to see legislation that forces this. And I don't know, and today's panel wasn't to really put a crystal ball on what's going to happen in the future, is really just to discuss the fact that this changes, we're in it, and we often can't see the forest through the trees. And that, I think, is, part and parcel of what we think about consent and identity and that kind of change. And, right before the COVID, there was a lot of press around location-based data and how that gets used. And I think you'll see possibly changes in the way that apps, we've been seeing it from the beginning, and certainly Apple is they've been at the forefront of pushing, restrictions on what people can do. And there's, a lot of bad actors in that app space. And then of course there's a lot of amazing ones because we use them all the time. and benefit from them. So again, I just think that this is larger than simply, the ad supported part of the web. It's everything we do. And I think we'll get crispier. I kind of was thinking that one thing that'll happen is we probably get more walled gardens, but certainly we get more precise, differently based identity graphs. Brands aren't used to using them. They outsource that. And so, don't you think that we'll start with, anybody that's using that? If I'm a publisher, I'm going to start seeing my data along with other datas in these data graphs that should be able to inform what I do. I don't know what we think about what happens to the identity graph business, but maybe Matt, you'd think about that. I think you have a big one.
Yeah, well, I think two things are true. I think everyone that is in the business of creating some type of personalized experience with consumers is going to have some version of their own identity graph. That said, for it to be useful, and back to this notion of having a truth set, a ground set of truth, I think there's going to be very few of us, and I do expect TransUnion to be one of them, that's actually going to have the type of information that makes those graphs worth anything, right? Which is to say, you need your own version of an identity graph, but if you aren't anchoring it on some accuracy, I think it's going to not be all that useful to you. Again, how do you expand it beyond your walls? And so I think it's of it a yes and. I bet that most companies invest directly in some level of infrastructure to understand their own view of identity, and then look for guys like TransUnion, not just to provide data, but to provide services to be able to ping in real time, as well as in a more offline batched way, to verify and continue to vet and enhance those views of identity. I think it's going to have to be yes and. Because again, what are companies like TransUnion uniquely good at? It is going through the process of sourcing data, cleaning it, matching it, linking it. Like that is there's a business there for a reason. I just don't think most marketers, most publishers want to be in that business. I think they're going to need services for that. But again, does that mean that they just outsource a whole view of identity? No. Again, I think I think there's a nuanced approach there that businesses are going to need help, because it's only getting more complex to figure this out.
Yeah. And that's something I wanted to note there. I mean, as I've been doing this consulting thing, like kind of over the past, 6 months or so, a lot of the conversations that I've been having with brands are them trying to figure out, do they need to build their own device graphs, or their version of it? But it's not full stock. It's just they have some of their own level of identity graph, right? And then they might go and use a piece of a piece of data from TransUnion, right? A syncing pixel from somebody else, but only for logged in authenticated traffic. So it's just kind of like they assemble it's not like they build it themselves, right? But they have to really understand what's the use case that I'm going after, what's my truth set of data, right? And then make sure they measure and externally verify along that path, and they end up with assembling something that works for them, but it's not built from scratch.
Well, and I just would encourage, don't confuse a device graph or identity graph. Those are not the same thing.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but it's like, but brands starting to raise their hands and say, hey, this identity thing is too important to me, right? And I need to understand it better, and starting to dig in instead of just signing a SaaS check, with say a LiveRamp as an example.
Just on that, Nate, specifically too, like I'm curious what you're hearing in market relative to this sort of temporal nature of consent, right? So sort of beyond identification and sort of identity graph, sort of having people opt in and opt out dynamically makes it far more challenging, obviously, for things like optimization and modeling and everything else that these organizations want to do with that data. I'm just curious on your opinion as sort of what you're seeing, how companies are approaching that with with the security that the data they're actually building or modeling off of is properly consented at the time when they're actually doing that.
I would say not well, right? Because this is my point, is like I don't think there's much room there. There's not, the solutions of technical enforcement of consent are not there, right? And there's a bunch of companies that are doing it, right? And so I think right now it's a little bit of a, you have the marketing manager who kind of got the infosec, person at the brand to basically approve a contract, and so like that's enough for now, and nobody wants to ask any more questions.
Right.
Right. So that's, is there, ultimately, kind of like, should there be some level of technical enforcement? I think there should be, but I think right now it's kind of mostly being overlooked. But it's being overlooked because the solution hasn't presented itself.
Right.
Right. But once the solution presents itself, we're like, oh, that's far better. Right. So, and that's how I see it.
Yeah. We have a bunch of questions, which are great ones. Let's start with the last question from Henry, because it kind of leads into something I'd said before. And that was kind of informed by, I saw this big global solution for helping manage identity, which was a JavaScript piece of JavaScript that would lay on every browser, and it would essentially be your digital social security number from a single supplier. First off, that won't, the EU regulators will never let that piece of JavaScript live. And two, I'm not sure the market's ready for a single source for these pieces, as we've discussed. So, but Henry brings up the CCPA does allow for global browser privacy-based settings. So it would be an easy button to opt in or opt out by default. Would like to hear from the panel their approach to this, what they think their approach to this will be. So if you can read that question in the Q&A, it's like, so what's going to happen with the easy button in or out? How do you think this works? It lives on the browser, and that agreement ends up.
As much as it's interesting to live on the browser, and I think there will be some development by Chrome, by Safari, and by Firefox to offer some solutions. And you can look at, Brave as a way that they're trying to create some sort of innovation in the browser space as well. Really, the user is not doing business with the browser. The business is being done, and the user is connecting with the publisher or the app. And as long as the app is the one that's making money from the user visiting and from the attention and the data, then that has to be a clear and transparent transaction. So, unless magically the browsers can come up with a solution by which the ratio of the money that they make and the ratio that the publishers make, which I don't actually see happening. That the control really has to be on that person, that company that's selling their services, their content or their utility. And again, that goes back to the publishers, and the publishers have to be able to offer and become good custodians of the user's data, and also upstream being able to offer that data, whether it is identity plus consent plus additional sort of segmentation upstream. They have to be the one that controls, and we've put out a number of technologies to offer this level of control to them. But to Nate's point, the market has to make a decision. And one of the other things that I need to just get in there is that the advertisers need to incentivize the publishers to do so, right? Today, there really isn't the monetary incentives that are evident, clear, and actionable for actors at the edge to do the right thing. There's a lot of incentive actually for publishers and apps to do the wrong thing, to not necessarily gather consent, but to tell others that they do have consent. And that's really unfortunate. And so again,
did that, right? I mean, in a way, they pushed it down somewhere, but used that as an advantage, like a blunt instrument.
Correct. So, a lot of things have to align in order for us to solve this problem, but we're working it as an industry diligently to get there.
The other thing is, it feels like in this conversation we focused on consent in more of a browser-based world versus where so much data is on apps, and we use them more, and people spend a lot more time in mobile than they do on their desktops.
How about connected televisions and connected devices in our home?
Right?
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, and just I think we want to think about this as it comes to regulation, that we let the internet grow largely unregulated for the longest time. And you can see this is changing in front of our very eyes, everything from content to responsibility of what's on your platform. So if TV is, what's on TV is regulated, and how you access what people view is regulated, right? Which is, you pay the consumer to give you information about what they watch, and radio is regulated, and newspapers have been regulated, magazines. We don't, the internet is largely unregulated, and I'm not bringing up regulation because I'm in favor of it. It's just, it's going to change around those pieces, because I think Congress has finally figured out, when this came up before, Congress was really concerned that government and others would know what library books you check out. You're like, they read your email, right? So going forward, I'm really curious if we don't have all the tools we've had with MAIDs and hashed emails and all this other bit, we're going to have a lot more. I guess the thing that you'd want to be is writing APIs, because there's going to be a lot of them. So for people that can write APIs, it's a little like the old days. So we have a history in, an industry of starting on the grassroots level and then building all these things. And then we pick winners and losers, and then consolidation happens, and we get to a spot where we break it all apart again and start from fresh. And I kind of feel like that's where we are. And that's, kind of the nature of everybody's conversation, because we're all talking about various point solutions here for the future, and nobody has like, this is how it's going to work. And I want to encourage, venture investment and private equity and the free flow of money into new ideas, because if 10 players take up 75% of the digital economy, and that's nobody on this panel today, there's going to be a lot of money to flow and a lot of opportunity going forward into the, in this decade. So we had another question from Joan. I'm not mentioning last names for privacy, but if you read that last question, does anybody want to? I saw a solution yesterday that, one, creates an encrypted fingerprint of identity information so that the actual PII never leaves the first party, and two, enables use of each party's data without each party having to actually ingest the other party's data. Does the panel think, what does the panel think about this approach? So fingerprinted consent to consent. You see that question? Anybody? Yeah, you're muted, Nate, but I think you have an answer.
Thanks, I was talking. So, yeah, I'll try there. I think I'm somewhat familiar with some of the solutions that do things like this, but maybe not the exact one that you're talking about, Joan. I think in general, the idea, I think it's going to happen more and more, right? That brands, as they get wise to what they do with information security, they're not going to allow their information, on the PIL level to leave their walls, right? And so, but there still has to be some way to technically enable, data sharing, right? And what you're describing here, is like there are ways to do that. You can keep your data, locked down, kind of behind your firewalls as a principal, as a brand or a publisher, right? And enable some level of matching or sharing, kind of with other providers. Now, what happens there is that matching and sharing is probably not going to happen at the PII level or the event level, right? But you have to end up doing, a cohort management, kind of, or like a taxonomy management, between the different entities. And that type of system, if the kind of the information security people and, people that are really think a lot about re-anonymization, right? There's some papers out there, academic, that say things like 95% or 98% of Americans can be re-identified just by 15 data points, right? Right. And as people start thinking, if people start realizing that, they're like, oh, I'm not going to let my information out. And so I think the market can move to either, you can still create value, you can still do measurement and optimization, all that things on either using the cohort-based, kind of information. But it's not going to be the whole idea of sending all of your data to one centralized place, I think is going to be very, very heavily scrutinized by information security. And so I think it either goes in a way that you just described, Joan, or another solution, which Matt was talking about, is something about the just-in-time data, right, is only using the pieces of information that you need, and that's all that's shared. So
Right.
I do think that's something that's, I do think we are at an inflection point that, those type of things are going to change over the next 5 years. But I don't exactly know whether the solution is, Joan, what you're talking about, something I referenced, or even Matt's kind of just-in-time approach.
Matt, I have a question for you, but I was going to, mention that as companies start getting lawsuits about the collection of data, you'll notice the overharvest of data that happens by a lot of companies. They just won't ask for. They have so much data on everybody, but if it becomes a liability, they'll stop collecting it, and that's probably a good thing for everybody. Matt, so we've had these great device graphs and identity graphs, and there's a lot of them, and now things are breaking apart a little bit. And I want to figure out how to personalize to a user, right? Who maybe, let's say that I'm Disney, and so I'm going to have that person on a TV set. I'm going to have them mobile. I'm going to have them on a desktop. I'll probably have them in some odd 5G configuration going forward. How in the world do you manage a world, even for a publisher that can't figure out who's opted in, and how do I manage what's happening on the TV set, because it's probably not going to be just ACR based and another. So thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would paraphrase, I think, and kind of what you're potentially also asking in there is, if the cookie is the common ID that we think about today, what's the next common ID? And my answer to that is there's not going to be one.
Right.
And that there'll be an ID space, but what underpins that ID is going to be a series of different identifiers. And I just fundamentally disagree with anyone that thinks that there's going to be a single identifier that we should all now rush behind.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard some talk that's going to be a hashed email, and that doesn't make any sense to me. Listen, we're taking, I can tell you from what we're building, is a yes and approach. We're looking for all of it. Hashed emails, mobile IDs, cookies were irrelevant, connected device IDs, name and address were irrelevant. Again, our bet is that we can aggregate as many identity signals as are out there, that we're going to be, again, a company that can handle this coming regulation and consent framework that's going to be necessary, and that's what will be needed, right? And again, we just want to be an enabler. We don't plan to do most of the last mile of what this ecosystem needs, but if we can provide that underpinning, because companies like us can handle kind of the complexities here, that we think that's a value. And my bet is, given everything we've spent the last hour talking about, this is only getting more complex, both on how you identify people and on how you get consent. Like, this doesn't seem to be getting easier anytime soon.
Don't think of identity as an ID like a hashed email. Think of identity like a donut, right? It doesn't have a center, and you have all these other IDs that are kind of around it that are linked together probabilistically.
Well, I've had a lot of donuts during COVID. Now I have one around my belly, and I think that's right. And really the whole impetus for putting this together, and I can't thank you guys all enough for joining, is really just that we're in the middle of change, and it's exciting. So thanks everybody, and we'll see you in the next one. Good.
Thank you, Brett.
Thanks, Brett.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Brett.
it.
See you guys.